Imagine waking up in a cold, damp cottage somewhere in medieval Europe. The morning air is heavy with smoke from the hearth, your throat is dry, and the only thing waiting on the table is not a jug of water, but a cup of weak ale. Your children drink the same, your spouse as well, and when you head to work in the fields or the market, you carry another flask of ale with you. In the evening, after a long day, you meet neighbors at the tavern, where laughter, gossip, and arguments all flow as easily as the beer. Why did people in the Middle Ages drink so much alcohol? At first glance, it might sound like a cliché that everyone back then stumbled around drunk. But when we look at chronicles, city records, and letters that have survived, we find something else entirely. Alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was woven into the very fabric of medieval life. From monasteries to castles, from peasant huts to royal banquets, beer and wine stood on every table. For most people, it wasn't a luxury or an indulgence, it was a necessity. But why? Why did a society so deeply bound by religion, ritual, and rules also build its daily rhythm around alcohol from dawn until dusk? To answer this, we must step back and imagine medieval life itself. Imagine waking in a wooden cottage with a thatched roof, the smell of smoke still hanging from the hearth, where the evening fire burned low. Water from the well is murky, often mixed with earth or crawling with tiny creatures invisible to the eye. Wells could be contaminated by waste, by animals, or by runoff from nearby fields. Drinking plain water was, quite simply, dangerous. People understood, even if they did not know the science of microbes, that water often brought illness. And so they turned to the safer option: ale, beer, or wine. Fermentation killed off many of the harmful elements, and alcohol, however mild, was a kind of shield against disease. To drink beer was, in many ways, to survive. But there was another, subtler reason. Alcohol was energy. The medieval diet was often heavy in bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat rare for the poor and fresh fruit limited by season. A mug of ale or a cup of wine was not just a drink, but a source of calories, sugars, and strength. Even so-called small beer, with a very low alcohol content, provided nourishment and hydration. Children drank it. Laborers drank it before working in the fields. Monks drank it with their meals in the cloister. It was a daily companion, and no one considered it unusual. From the perspective of medieval culture, alcohol also carried ritual meaning. Weddings, feasts, church holidays, and village fairs all were unimaginable without the clinking of mugs and the pouring of wine. Chronicles describe barrels rolled into town squares, communal cups passed from hand to hand, and songs echoing late into the night. Alehouses, the medieval version of taverns, were not just places to drink, but centers of social life. Where news was exchanged, agreements were made, and sometimes quarrels ended in fights. Alcohol was as much a language of community as it was a beverage. Monasteries, too, played a major role in this story. Monks were among the best brewers and winemakers of the age. Within their walls, careful records were kept of brewing processes, grape harvests, and cellars lined with casks. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed moderation, but moderation still meant daily consumption. Beer and wine were considered gifts of God, and monastic skill helped spread both quality and quantity across medieval Europe. Some monasteries became famous for their beer, a tradition that in some cases continues to this very day. And yet, it would be wrong to think of medieval drinking as simply innocent necessity. Chroniclers also warn of excess. Moralists wrote sermons against drunkenness, describing it as a gateway to sin, violence, and shame. In court documents, we find countless records of brawls, thefts, and even murders committed under the influence of drink. Drinking was both a blessing and a danger, something essential and unavoidable, yet feared for its potential to unleash chaos. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of a medieval town at midday. The market square is alive with voices, merchants calling out their goods, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, children chasing one another between stalls. And what do you see at the edge of the square? The tavern. Its wooden sign creaks in the wind. The smell of smoke and roasted meat drifts out, and inside mugs of ale are already being passed around. For townsfolk, the tavern was more than a place to drink. It was their living room, their meeting hall, their court of gossip and negotiation. Here, disputes were settled, songs were sung, and travelers shared stories from distant lands. And always, at the center of it all, flowed beer and wine. Now imagine stepping into a peasant's cottage at the end of a long harvest day. The family gathers around the table. A pot of thick porridge steams, a loaf of dark bread is broken, and alongside it, a pitcher of ale. Even children take small cups. To us, this may sound shocking, but to them it was ordinary life. The ale they drank was weak, often less than 1% alcohol, brewed for nourishment rather than intoxication. This small beer was safer than water and sustained them through grueling labor. Imagine the satisfaction of that first sip after hours bent over in the fields, cool, slightly bitter, filling the stomach with warmth. Alcohol also served as medicine. Imagine a medieval healer preparing remedies in a dimly lit chamber. Herbs steeped in wine, tinctures preserved in spirits, and beer infused with medicinal plants. Physicians recommended wine for digestive troubles, beer for strength, and stronger brews as antiseptics for wounds. To drink was not only to quench thirst, but to heal the body, or at least to believe so. In a world with little access to modern medicine, alcohol was one of the few reliable tools at hand. Yet the story of medieval alcohol cannot be told without monasteries. Step inside a stone cloister where monks in plain robes move silently between the chapel, the library, and the brewery. In the cool darkness of their cellars, barrels of ale and wine rest, crafted with care and precision. Brewing was part of their sacred rhythm, measured, recorded, perfected over generations. Monks believed moderation was a virtue, but moderation in their world still meant drinking daily, often several times. For them, beer was nourishment during fasting periods, and wine symbolized both divine blessing and earthly comfort. To raise a cup of monk-brewed ale was to taste centuries of tradition. At feasts, alcohol reached its most spectacular role. Picture a noble hall lit by flickering torches, the long tables groaning under roasted meats and spiced pies. Jesters entertain, musicians play lutes and drums, and goblets of wine are raised again and again. Drinking was a display of status, a way to show wealth and hospitality. Chronicles describe kings hosting banquets where rivers of wine flowed, sometimes even fountains built to spout it. Guests competed in drinking contests, alliances were toasted, and secrets whispered after the third or fourth cup. The blur of laughter, music, and drunken cheer filled the rafters late into the night. But beneath all the joy lurked danger. Drunken quarrels could erupt into violence. City officials often complained about disorder caused by excessive drinking. One could stumble through dark alleys after too much ale, only to be robbed or attacked. Moralists thundered from pulpits against drunkenness, describing it as the devil's snare. And yet, sermons did little to slow the flow of drink. For every warning about sin, there were 10 more reasons to pour another mug. Safety, nourishment, healing, celebration, or simply the joy of forgetting hardship for a while. Picture a peasant woman in a small village near Paris. She wakes before dawn, lights the hearth, and sets a pot to boil with barley, oats, and herbs. This is not breakfast porridge. It is the beginnings of ale. Brewing was part of her household duty, just as important as baking bread. The children would gather nettle, yarrow, or heather to flavor the brew. Once ready, the drink nourished the whole family for days. She did not think of herself as a brewer, yet she was one. Across medieval Europe, women were the keepers of ale, brewing not only for their households, but sometimes selling the surplus to neighbors. A jug of fresh ale might be exchanged for a loaf of better bread or a piece of cheese. This was not commerce in the modern sense. It was survival, trust, and community woven together through the cup. In university towns like Bologna or Oxford, students crowded into taverns after lectures, parchments and ink-stained fingers set aside for mugs of ale. Their debates about philosophy, theology, or law quickly blurred as the drink flowed. Town records speak of rowdy students disturbing the peace, brawling in the streets, or clashing with townsfolk after heavy drinking. Yet these taverns were their social hubs, where friendships were forged and rivalries flared. The laughter of young men reciting verses they barely remembered, or challenging one another to drinking games, filled the rooms. Their futures as priests, lawyers, or officials felt far away under the haze of the evening. At the other end of society stood the noble wedding feast. The hall was richly decorated, banners hung from the rafters, and minstrels tuned their instruments. Dozens of barrels of wine were brought in, some imported at enormous cost from southern vineyards. As the bride and groom made their entrance, goblets were raised high and the toasts began. Guests were expected to drink deeply in honor of the new union. To refuse would be an insult. The bride's nervous smile met the roar of cheer, while the groom was already flushed with wine before the first dance. For nobles, alcohol was more than a drink. It was ceremony, prosperity, and a public performance of generosity. But not all stories of drink were joyous. Imagine a poor craftsman in a German town, exhausted after a long day at the forge. He enters a tavern to drown his worries, drinking more than he can afford. The next morning, his family goes hungry because the week's wages were left in the tavern keeper's hands. Chronicles and sermons often warned of this very scene, the dangers of drunken poverty destroying households. Yet, even in failure, alcohol offered a temporary escape, a fleeting taste of joy in a life weighed down by hardship. Monks, too, had their own complicated ties to excessive drinking. In Burgundy, a cloistered brother might rise with the sun to tend the vineyards, pruning vines, checking barrels, sampling fermenting wine. For him, wine was both work and worship, the sacred blood of Christ and the livelihood of the monastery. But temptation was never far. Records tell of friars stumbling into mass or abbots scolding brothers for drunkenness. One can almost see the quiet shame of a monk caught asleep in the cloister, head spinning from too much ale the night before. Their vows called for moderation, yet they remained human. There were also tales of miraculous drink. Stories spread of saints turning water into wine, or of holy springs that, once blessed, flowed like ale. Such legends reflected the deep bond between alcohol and medieval imagination. Drink was not merely physical, it was mystical, bound to ideas of blessing, joy, and divine favor. And then came the darker side, a village festival where merriment turned violent. Ale flowed too freely, grudges flared, and knives were suddenly drawn. City councils across Europe tried to regulate taverns, limiting hours or imposing heavy taxes. Yet no decree could erase the truth. Alcohol was woven into the very fabric of daily life. In the next part, let us look at how drinking habits differed across medieval Europe. In the bustling cities of Italy, Florence, Siena, or Venice, wine dominated daily life. Vineyards stretched across the countryside, barrels rolled through tavern doors, and noble houses displayed their finest vintages with pride. A Venetian merchant might start the day with watered wine at breakfast, enjoy a stronger vintage at noon, and finish with a sweet dessert wine by night. In Southern Europe, wine was more than nourishment. It was identity, culture, and tradition. To decline a cup would have been almost unthinkable. Traveling north told a different story. In England, Flanders, or Germany, wine was a costly luxury reserved for the elite. Ordinary people lived on beer and ale. English inns filled with farmers at day's end, gathering around wooden tables with mugs of thick, frothy ale. Children drank weak, small beer, while adults relied on stronger brews as daily sustenance. Alehouses became centers of gossip, song, and disputes, sometimes settled with words, sometimes with fists. Monasteries also shaped regional drinking. In Burgundy, monks cultivated vineyards whose wines were coveted by kings and popes. In Bavaria, their brothers perfected brewing, laying foundations for beers still celebrated today. Both wine and beer were sacred offerings, but also sources of wealth and power. Further north, Scandinavia kept alive the ancient tradition of mead, a honey-based drink tied to pagan ritual. Feasts in longhouses glowed with firelight as warriors and poets shared horns of mead, binding community through drink and story. In Bohemia, beer was so central that attempts to tax or restrict it sparked open revolt. Chroniclers describe citizens storming breweries, demanding their right to drink. Here, beer became more than a beverage. It was a symbol of freedom and tradition, even a political weapon. France revealed another contrast. In Champagne or Bordeaux, nobles boasted of refined wines, while peasants survived on watered-down vintages. Parisian courts sipped from crystal goblets, but just beyond the city walls, rough ale was served in wooden mugs. Alcohol reflected the sharp divide between rich and poor, yet it was also a custom shared by all. Spain, too, bore its own mark. Moorish influence shaped irrigation and grape varieties, enriching Andalusian vineyards that produced renowned sweet wines. In Granada's courts, nobles paired spiced wine with poetry and music, while in the Castilian countryside, shepherds passed around simple skins of sour wine. Different classes and faiths met over drink, even in times of conflict. Across Europe, alcohol defined identity. Italians expressed themselves through wine, the English through ale, Scandinavians through mead. A traveler moving across the continent would taste its diversity in every cup: a Tuscan red, a smoky German beer, a honeyed northern mead. Each drink carried the flavor of its land, its faith, and its people. Yet one truth connected them all. Alcohol was never just a drink. It was ritual and identity, a bond across classes and a shared language of community. From golden goblets in noble halls to rough mugs in village taverns. For all its importance, alcohol also carried risks. Too much ale often ended in brawls, injuries, or shame. City records tell of tavern fights, drunken assaults, and thefts committed under the haze of drink. Chroniclers wrote of nobles disgracing themselves at banquets, monks punished for scandalous behavior, and peasants beaten for speaking too freely after one mug too many. Even kings were not exempt. Rumors of rulers who drank to excess spread quickly, undermining their authority. Health was another concern. Physicians examined pulses and urine, warning about the damage caused by heavy drinking. They noted its effects on the stomach, liver, and mind. And yet, the very same doctors prescribed wine as medicine, infused with herbs, applied as antiseptic, or recommended as a remedy for melancholy. Alcohol was a paradox, both cure and poison, blessing and danger. But in the end, drinking was never just about quenching thirst. It was survival in times of scarcity, identity in different regions, and ritual in daily life. Wine shaped culture in the South, beer sustained the North, and mead carried the memory of older traditions. To drink was to belong, to share in community, to find warmth against hardship, and to take part in the rhythm of medieval life. So, when we ask, why did people in the Middle Ages drink so much alcohol? The answer lies not only in unsafe water or abundant harvests, but in the human longing for comfort, for ritual, and for joy in a fragile world. Alcohol was food, medicine, and symbol, danger and hope in equal measure. And with that, we raise our cup to the past and the people who lived it. Cheers.